She was forced to marry him, then discovered her fiancé was an escaped slave in disguise. The true story that shocked historians. 0. Opening hook. On a cold October night in 1847, a young woman named Margaret stood barefoot in the rain, clutching a crumpled letter in her trembling hands. The ink was bleeding in the downpour, but she'd already read it 3 times. Her fiancé, the man she was supposed to marry in less than 12 hours, wasn't who he claimed to be. The letter revealed a truth so dangerous that speaking it aloud could get them both killed. She looked back at the farmhouse where he slept, unaware that she knew his secret, and she had to make an impossible choice. Run and save herself, or stay and risk everything for a man who had been lying to her since the day they met. What she decided that night would set off a chain of events that historians would argue about for over a century. This is the true story of a forced marriage, a hidden identity, and a twist so shocking that even I had trouble believing it when I first discovered it. 045. Engagement prompt. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 1. The setup. Margaret Collins was 22 years old in the autumn of 1847, living in a small farming community outside of Richmond, Virginia. She wasn't born into wealth, but her family had once been comfortable, respectable even. Her father owned a modest tobacco farm, her mother kept a neat house, and Margaret had been educated enough to read, write, and dream of something more than becoming a farmer's wife. But 3 years of bad harvests had changed everything. The debt piled up, the creditors came calling, and her parents grew desperate. That's when Thomas Whitmore appeared. He was new to town, well-spoken, handsome in a quiet sort of way, and most importantly, he had money. No one knew much about where he came from. He said he'd inherited land up north and was looking to settle down. Margaret's father saw an opportunity. Margaret saw a prison sentence. She didn't love Thomas. She barely knew him. But her parents made it clear she didn't have a choice. The wedding was arranged, the dress was sewn, the church was booked, and Margaret felt like she was drowning. Thomas was kind to her, which somehow made it worse. He brought her flowers. He asked about her interests. He listened when she talked about wanting to teach children someday. But there was something off about him, something she couldn't name. Sometimes his accent would shift mid-sentence, a smooth northern tone slipping into something rougher, more southern. His hands were calloused and scarred in ways that didn't match his story of inheriting wealth, and he never, ever talked about his past. Whenever she asked about his family or where he grew up, he'd deflect with a joke or change the subject entirely. Margaret noticed these things, but she didn't know what they meant. Not yet. The town itself was unremarkable, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Gossip spread faster than wildfire, and newcomers were always scrutinized. Thomas had arrived 6 months earlier, purchased a small property on the edge of town, and kept mostly to himself. Some folks thought he was standoffish, others thought he was just private, but there were whispers. A few people claimed they'd seen him before, somewhere else, though they couldn't remember where. One old woman swore she'd seen him flinch when a slave catcher rode through town. These were just rumors, the kind of talk that happens in every small town, but they planted seeds of doubt in Margaret's mind. 4:30. Building tension. 3 weeks before the wedding, a stranger came to town. He was a rough-looking man, mid-40s, with cold eyes and a badge that identified him as a federal marshal. He said he was passing through, looking for someone who might have come this way. He didn't give a name or description, but he asked questions. He showed up at the general store, the tavern, the church. He wanted to know about new arrivals, people who kept to themselves, anyone who seemed nervous around authorities. Margaret didn't think much of it at first. Marshals came through sometimes, looking for fugitives or investigating crimes. But then she noticed Thomas. He'd gone pale. He stopped coming into town. He suddenly wanted to move up the wedding date. When Margaret asked why, he said he'd received word about business up north that required his immediate attention after the ceremony. It didn't make sense. Nothing about Thomas made sense anymore. Margaret started paying closer attention. She watched the way he moved, always aware of who was around him. She noticed how he never went anywhere without checking over his shoulder. One evening, she found him staring out the window long after dark, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. She asked if something was wrong. He smiled and said everything was fine, but his eyes told a different story. They told a story of a man who was terrified. Then came the night that changed everything. It was 2 days before the wedding. Margaret had been staying at Thomas's house to help prepare for the ceremony, chaperoned by her aunt who slept in the next room. She couldn't sleep. The anxiety about the wedding, about Thomas, about her entire future, pressed down on her chest like a weight. She got up and wandered through the dark house, and that's when she saw it. A leather satchel, partially hidden under Thomas's bed. She shouldn't have looked. She knew that. But her hands moved before her mind could stop them. Inside the satchel were papers, documents with different names on them, travel passes that had been forged. You could tell by the inconsistent handwriting. And then she found the letter. It was old, worn, folded and refolded so many times the creases had nearly torn through. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. It was addressed to someone named Gabriel, and it was from a woman who signed herself only as Mama. The letter talked about a son who had run away, who she prayed had made it to freedom, who she hoped would never come back because they'd kill him if they found him. Margaret's hands started shaking. She read it again, and suddenly everything clicked into place. Thomas wasn't his real name. He wasn't a wealthy northern landowner. He was an escaped slave, and she was about to marry him. 8:45. The realization. Margaret sat on the floor of that dark room, holding the letter, and her mind raced through everything she thought she knew. The scars on his hands weren't from farm work. They were from chains. The shifts in his accent weren't carelessness. They were slips back into his real voice. The fear in his eyes when the marshal came to town wasn't paranoia. It was survival instinct. He'd been running, hiding, pretending to be someone else for so long that he'd almost convinced himself. Almost. Margaret should have been angry. She should have felt betrayed. Instead, she felt something else entirely. She felt terrified, not of Thomas, but for him, because she knew what happened to escaped slaves when they were caught. She'd seen it. Everyone had. The public whippings, the chains, the brutal journey back to plantations down south, where punishments were designed to break spirits and bodies. If Thomas was discovered, if anyone in town realized who he really was, he wouldn't just lose his freedom, he'd lose his life. But there was another problem. If Margaret married him, if she became his wife, without revealing his secret, she'd be complicit. She'd be harboring a fugitive. She could be arrested, fined, imprisoned. Her family could lose everything. And if she did reveal his secret, if she told the authorities or even just her parents, she'd be sentencing him to death. It was an impossible choice, the kind that strips away everything you thought you believed about yourself. Margaret put the letter back exactly where she found it. She didn't sleep that night. She just sat by the window, watching the darkness, trying to figure out what kind of person she wanted to be. By morning, she still didn't have an answer. But time was running out. The wedding was in 48 hours. The marshal was still in town. And Thomas, or Gabriel, or whoever he really was, had no idea that his carefully constructed life was about to crumble. 11:30. The confrontation. Margaret couldn't pretend anymore. The next day, she waited until her aunt went into town for supplies, and she confronted Thomas. She walked into the kitchen where he was reading the newspaper, trying to look casual, trying to be the person he was pretending to be. She placed the letter on the table in front of him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Thomas stared at the letter like it was a ghost. Then he looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not fear, not anger, resignation. He'd been caught, and he knew it. He didn't try to lie. He didn't try to explain it away. He just asked her a simple question: "What are you going to do?" Margaret sat down across from him, and they had the most honest conversation of their entire relationship. His real name was Gabriel. He'd been born on a plantation in Georgia, separated from his mother when he was 12, sold to a tobacco farm in North Carolina, where the overseer was notorious for his cruelty. Gabriel had scars all over his back from whippings. He'd watched men die from heat exhaustion in the fields. He'd seen women assaulted with no recourse. And one night, after the overseer beat a young boy so badly he stopped breathing, Gabriel decided he'd rather die trying to escape than live one more day in chains. He ran. He traveled only at night, hid during the day, followed the North Star like so many others before him. He was caught twice. The first time, he talked his way out of it by pretending to be a free man, running an errand for his master. The second time, he fought and barely escaped with his life. When he finally made it north, he knew he couldn't just live as a free black man. The Fugitive Slave Act meant slave catchers could operate anywhere. His old master had put out notices, offered rewards, so Gabriel became Thomas. He forged documents. He bought clothes that made him look respectable. He learned to speak differently, carry himself differently. He created an entire identity, and it worked. Until now. Margaret listened to all of this, and she asked him why he'd tried to marry her. Gabriel's answer was heartbreaking in its simplicity. He wanted to be real. He was so tired of pretending, of lying, of looking over his shoulder every second of every day. He thought if he could build a normal life, a family, something that looked like what everyone else had, maybe he could finally feel human again. He knew it was selfish. He knew he was putting her at risk. But he was desperate, and desperate people make choices they can't take back. Margaret asked him if he loved her. Gabriel paused for a long time before answering. He said he respected her. He admired her. He thought maybe, given time, he could love her. But right now, he mostly just needed her. And that honesty, as painful as it was, meant something to Margaret. Asterisk, asterisk 16. The decision. Asterisk, asterisk. Margaret had a choice to make, and she made it in that kitchen with the autumn sun streaming through the windows. She told Gabriel she wasn't going to marry him. Not because she was going to turn him in, but because she couldn't live a lie that big. She couldn't wake up every day wondering if this was the day they'd both be arrested. She couldn't have children who'd grow up with a father who might disappear at any moment. But she also told him she wasn't going to report him. Instead, she was going to help him run. Gabriel was stunned. He asked her why she'd risk everything for someone she barely knew. Margaret's answer was simple. Because it's the right thing to do. Because no one deserves to be hunted like an animal for wanting to be free. And because if their roles were reversed, she'd hope someone would do the same for her. They made a plan. That night, Margaret would tell her parents she needed to visit her cousin in the next county to clear her head before the wedding. It wasn't unusual. Brides got nervous. Her parents would understand. Meanwhile, Gabriel would pack only what he could carry and prepare to leave immediately. Margaret would take the family's wagon and meet him at an old abandoned mill 3 miles outside of town. From there, she'd drive him to the next safe house on the Underground Railroad. She'd gotten the information from a Quaker woman in town who everyone knew helped fugitives, though no one spoke about it openly. The plan was risky. If they were caught together, if anyone saw them, both their lives were over. But it was the only chance Gabriel had. The marshal was getting closer. People were starting to talk. Time had run out. 19. The escape attempt. That night, everything went wrong. Margaret told her parents about visiting her cousin, and they agreed, relieved that she seemed to be accepting the wedding. She packed a small bag, hugged her mother, and left just after sunset. The plan was to take the wagon, but when she got to the barn, she found it had a broken wheel. Her father must have noticed it that afternoon and hadn't mentioned it. Panic started to set in. She couldn't take the wagon. She'd have to ride one of the horses, which meant Gabriel couldn't bring anything with him. She rode hard to the mill, arriving just before midnight. Gabriel was already there, waiting in the shadows. She told him about the wagon, and they quickly revised the plan. They'd ride together on her horse until they reached the safe house, about 15 miles north. It would be slower, more exposed, but they didn't have another option. They rode through the darkness, keeping to the woods, avoiding the main roads. Margaret had never done anything like this in her life. She'd never broken the law. She'd barely even lied to her parents. But here she was, helping a fugitive escape. And the strange thing was, she didn't regret it. She felt terrified, yes, but also alive in a way she'd never experienced. For the first time in months, she was making a choice that was entirely her own. They were about 5 miles from the safe house when they heard dogs. The sound carried through the still night air, distant but unmistakable. Bloodhounds. Someone had figured out Gabriel was gone. Maybe the marshal had been watching the house. Maybe a neighbor had seen them leave. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they were being hunted. Gabriel told Margaret to leave him. He'd run on foot, lead the dogs away, and she could go home and pretend she'd never been involved. Margaret refused. She'd come this far. She wasn't abandoning him now. They pushed the horse harder, but the animal was already exhausted. The baying of the dogs grew louder, and then they saw torches in the distance, moving through the trees. A search party. Margaret's mind raced. They weren't going to make it to the safe house. They needed to hide, and they needed to do it now. She remembered an old tobacco barn her family used to own before they sold off parcels of land to pay debts. It was empty now, half collapsed, but it was close. She steered the horse off the path and toward the barn, praying her memory was right. 23:30. The hiding. They made it to the barn with minutes to spare. Margaret helped Gabriel inside, and they pulled loose boards over the entrance to hide it. The barn smelled of rotted wood and old tobacco. Rain had started to fall, heavy and cold, which would make it harder for the dogs to track them, but also made the night more miserable. They huddled in the darkness, listening as the voices and torches came closer. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she thought it might give them away. Gabriel put a hand on her shoulder, steadying her, and they waited. The search party passed within 100 yards of the barn. They could hear men shouting instructions, dogs barking, horses stomping. Someone yelled that they'd lost the trail. Someone else suggested checking the old barn's property. Margaret held her breath. The barn's property was 3 miles east. If they went that direction, she and Gabriel might have a chance. The voices faded. The torches moved away. And after what felt like hours, silence returned. They stayed in that barn until dawn, not speaking, barely moving. When the sun started to rise, Margaret knew they had to make a decision. The safe house was still 10 miles away, but traveling in daylight was suicide. Gabriel suggested that Margaret go home, make up a story about her horse throwing a shoe and having to stay overnight at an inn. She could say she never made it to her cousin's house. Meanwhile, he'd hide in the barn during the day and try to move again tomorrow night. It was a terrible plan, but it was all they had. Margaret agreed, but before she left, she gave Gabriel all the food she'd brought and the little money she had in her pockets. She told him to wait 3 days. She'd come back with supplies and information. If she didn't come back, he should assume she'd been caught and run as far and fast as he could. Gabriel thanked her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw him smile. Not the careful, controlled smile of Thomas Whitmore, but a real, genuine smile from Gabriel. It broke her heart. 27-0. The aftermath. Margaret rode home in the early morning light, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. She needed a story that would hold up under scrutiny. She needed to act normal. She needed to survive the next few days without raising suspicion. When she arrived home, her mother was frantic with worry. Margaret told her the horse had gone lame, and she'd had to walk it to a nearby farm and stay there overnight. Her mother was upset that she hadn't sent word, but she was mostly just relieved Margaret was safe. Then came the hard part. Margaret's father told her that Thomas Whitmore had disappeared. His house was empty. Some of his belongings were gone. The marshal was asking questions about him, suggesting he might have been involved in something illegal. Margaret feigned shock. She asked what could have happened. Her father said no one knew, but the wedding was obviously canceled. Margaret pretended to be devastated, hurt and confused by her fiancé's sudden disappearance. Inside, she felt relief. If they thought Thomas had run on his own, they might not connect her to his escape. The next 3 days were agony. Margaret went through the motions of normal life, helping her mother with chores, attending church, avoiding questions from neighbors about the canceled wedding. Meanwhile, the search for Thomas Whitmore continued. The marshal put up notices offering a reward for information. Some folks speculated he'd been a con man all along, taking money and disappearing. Others thought maybe he'd been murdered and his body hidden somewhere. The theories multiplied, but no one suspected the truth. On the third night, Margaret packed a bag with food, water, and blankets. She told her parents she was going to stay with her cousin for a few days to recover from the shock and embarrassment of being abandoned. This time, they didn't question her. They thought distance and time would help her heal. Margaret rode back to the barn, her heart in her throat, praying Gabriel was still alive. 31-0. The revelation. When Margaret reached the barn, it was empty. For a moment, she thought he'd been caught or had run without waiting for her. Then she noticed a piece of cloth tied to a post, a signal they'd agreed on. He was nearby, but had moved to a safer location. She followed a path deeper into the woods until she found him hiding in a hollow beneath a fallen tree. He looked exhausted, thinner, but alive. Margaret gave him the supplies and told him what had happened in town. The search was still active, but it was losing momentum. The marshal had moved on to the next county, following a false lead. Gabriel had maybe a week before they widened the search again. They needed to get him to the safe house now. They traveled that night, moving slowly and carefully. Margaret knew these woods better than any search party would. She led Gabriel through paths she'd explored as a child, across streams that would hide their scent, around areas where farmers might spot them. It took them all night, but they reached the safe house just before dawn. It was a simple farmhouse owned by a Quaker family who asked no questions. The woman who answered the door took one look at Gabriel and ushered him inside. She told Margaret she'd done a brave thing, but now she needed to go home and never speak of this again. The less Margaret knew about where Gabriel went from here, the safer they both would be. Margaret understood. She looked at Gabriel one last time. He thanked her, said he'd never forget what she did, and told her she'd saved his life. Margaret didn't know what to say, so she just nodded and left. She rode home as the sun came up, feeling a strange mixture of grief and pride. She'd never see Gabriel again. She'd never know if he made it to real freedom or was eventually caught. But she'd done something that mattered. She'd chosen courage over comfort, risk over safety. And even though her life would go back to normal, even though she'd have to pretend none of this ever happened, she knew she'd never be the same person again. Over the next few weeks, the talk about Thomas Whitmore faded. People lost interest. New scandals emerged. Margaret's parents stopped bringing it up, relieved the whole embarrassing situation was behind them. Life moved on. But Margaret carried the secret with her, a weight she'd bear for the rest of her life. 36-0. The unexpected turn. 6 months passed. Margaret had resigned herself to the quiet life her parents wanted for her. She was teaching reading to children in town, finding small fulfillment in work that didn't involve a forced marriage. She rarely thought about Gabriel anymore, or at least she tried not to. Then, one spring morning, a letter arrived. It wasn't addressed to her directly, but to a pseudonym she'd used once, a name only one person would know. Her hands shook as she opened it. The letter was short and careful, written in a way that wouldn't incriminate anyone if it was intercepted. It said that a mutual friend was safe, had reached his destination, and wanted her to know that her kindness had given him a new life. He was working, learning a trade, and for the first time in his existence, he didn't have to look over his shoulder every moment. The letter didn't say where he was or give any identifying details, but it was signed with a single letter, G. Margaret read the letter 3 times, then burned it in the fireplace, as she knew she should. But the words stayed with her. What Margaret didn't know was that Gabriel's story was far more complicated than she'd imagined. After reaching the safe house, he'd been moved along the Underground Railroad through a network of brave people who risked everything to help fugitives. He traveled through Pennsylvania, then New York, and eventually crossed into Canada, where slavery had been abolished. In Canada, Gabriel reclaimed his real name and began to build an actual life, not a disguise. He worked as a carpenter, saved his money, and eventually opened his own small workshop. But he never forgot the woman who'd saved him when she had every reason not to. He asked about her, carefully, through the network of people who'd helped him. He learned she was safe, unmarried, teaching children, and he held on to the hope that maybe, someday, he could thank her properly. 40-0. The years pass. 3 years went by. Margaret's life was quiet but meaningful. She continued teaching, became more involved in her community, and slowly rebuilt the reputation that had been damaged by the scandal of her canceled wedding. People mostly forgot about Thomas Whitmore. A few folks occasionally wondered what had happened to him, but it became one of those small-town mysteries that faded with time. Margaret never married. She received proposals from a few men, but she always declined. Her parents worried she'd become an old maid, but Margaret didn't care. She'd tasted real freedom, real choice, and she wouldn't give it up for the security of a marriage she didn't want. She kept her secret buried deep, never telling anyone what really happened that night. Sometimes she wondered if Gabriel had been caught, if he was still alive, if he ever thought about her. She had no way of knowing, and that uncertainty was its own kind of burden. Then, in 1851, everything changed. The Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened, giving slave catchers more power and making it even more dangerous for escaped slaves and those who helped them. Margaret watched as fear spread through the community, as people whispered about neighbors who might be harboring fugitives, as suspicion turned friends against each other. She kept her head down and her mouth shut. But late one night, there was a knock on her door. When she opened it, a woman she'd never seen before was standing there. The woman said she was part of the network, and someone needed Margaret's help. Margaret's first instinct was to say no. She'd done her part. She'd risked enough. But then the woman said the person who needed help had specifically asked for her. He said she was the only one he trusted. Margaret's heart stopped. She knew immediately who it was. 44-0. The return. Gabriel had returned. Not to Virginia, but close enough that he needed to pass through on his way to help someone else escape. He'd become part of the network himself, using his experience and knowledge to guide others to freedom. But a situation had gone wrong. A family he was helping had been spotted, and now slave catchers were close behind them. Gabriel needed a place to hide them for one night. Just one, before they could continue north. And he'd remembered the old tobacco barn. He'd remembered Margaret. When Margaret saw Gabriel again after 3 years, she barely recognized him. He'd gained weight, looked healthier, carried himself with a confidence she'd never seen before. He smiled when he saw her, that real smile she'd glimpsed once in the barn, and he said he was sorry for coming back into her life, but he had nowhere else to turn. Margaret didn't hesitate. She told him to bring the family to the barn, and she'd make sure they had everything they needed. That night, Margaret brought food, blankets, and medicine to the barn where Gabriel was hiding with a woman, her husband, and their 2 young children. The family was terrified, exhausted, and desperate. Margaret helped tend to the children, who were sick from days of traveling in harsh conditions. She and Gabriel worked side by side like they'd done this 100 times before, though in reality, it had only been once. When the family was settled and the children were finally sleeping, Gabriel and Margaret sat outside the barn and talked. He told her about his new life in Canada, about the work he was doing to help others escape, about how he lived every day with gratitude for the chance she'd given him. Margaret asked if he ever regretted running, if the constant danger was worth it. Gabriel said it was the only thing worth doing. He couldn't be free while others were still in chains. He had to help. It was his purpose. Margaret told him about her life, the quiet satisfaction of teaching, the loneliness of keeping such a huge secret, the fear that someday someone would figure out what she'd done and she'd be arrested. Gabriel listened, and then he said something that would haunt Margaret for years. He said she was one of the bravest people he'd ever met, and he wished things could have been different. He wished they'd met in a different time, a different place, where they could have known each other as real people without all the fear and secrecy. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes because she wished for the same thing. For a brief moment, sitting outside that barn under the stars, they weren't a fugitive and his accomplice. They were just 2 people who'd found each other in impossible circumstances and wondered what might have been. 50-0. The final goodbye. The next morning, Gabriel and the family left before dawn. Margaret never saw him again. She heard rumors over the years, stories about a man who was helping dozens of slaves escape, who'd become almost legendary in the network. She never knew for sure if it was Gabriel, but she liked to think it was. She imagined him living a full life, maybe even finding love, building something real and lasting. It gave her comfort on the nights when the weight of her secret felt too heavy to bear. Margaret lived to be 73 years old. She never married. She taught hundreds of children over her lifetime. She was respected in her community, known for her kindness and her quiet strength. And when she died in 1882, her belongings were modest. Some books, clothes, a few pieces of jewelry. But hidden in the lining of an old trunk, her niece found something strange. A collection of letters, all addressed to different pseudonyms, all carefully written to avoid any identifying details, but all signed with a single letter, G. The niece didn't understand what the letters meant. She showed them to her mother, Margaret's sister, who said she had no idea. The letters were eventually stored away with other family documents and forgotten for decades. But in 1923, a historian researching the Underground Railroad in Virginia came across the letters in a donation of family papers to a local historical society. The historian immediately recognized what they were: correspondence between a conductor on the Underground Railroad and someone who'd helped fugitives escape. The historian spent years trying to identify who these people were, cross-referencing names and dates and locations, and eventually, the truth emerged. Margaret Collins, the quiet schoolteacher who'd never married, had been part of the network. And the man who'd signed those letters, the man she'd risked everything to save, was Gabriel Freeman, one of the most successful conductors on the Underground Railroad. He'd helped over 200 people escape to freedom before dying of pneumonia in Canada in 1869. He'd lived a full life, but he'd never forgotten the woman who'd given him that chance. 54 to 30. The twist. But here's the part that shocked even the historians who studied this case. Among the letters, there was one that was different. It was dated 1868, a year before Gabriel died. In this letter, Gabriel revealed something he'd never told anyone. The night he'd come back to Virginia to hide that family in the barn, he'd made a decision. He'd wanted to stay. He'd wanted to tell Margaret that he loved her, that he'd loved her since the moment she chose to help him instead of turn him in. He'd wanted to ask if she'd come to Canada with him, build a life together, finally stop running. But he didn't ask, because he knew what her answer would have been. She had a life in Virginia, a purpose, students who needed her. Asking her to leave would have been selfish. So he left without saying anything, carrying that regret for the rest of his life. But he wanted her to know, even if it was too late, even if she'd never read the letter, that she'd been the love of his life. He'd just never told her. The historian who found this letter tried to determine if Margaret had ever received it. The evidence suggests she hadn't. The letter was found among Gabriel's possessions after his death, sealed but never sent. He'd written it, but he'd never had the courage to mail it. Margaret died 13 years after Gabriel, never knowing how he truly felt. The historian published a book about their story in 1927, and it became a minor sensation. People were fascinated by the idea of this hidden love story, this connection between two people who'd been kept apart by the world they lived in. But many people missed the real point of the story. This wasn't just a tragic romance. This was a story about choice, about doing the right thing when it costs you everything, about the quiet courage of ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice. Margaret wasn't a hero because she fell in love with an escaped slave. She was a hero because when faced with an impossible decision, she chose compassion over safety. She chose humanity over the law, and she lived with the consequences of that choice for the rest of her life without ever seeking recognition or praise. 58 to 0. Closing reflection. So here's what I want you to think about. What would you have done in Margaret's position? If you'd found that letter? If you'd learned the truth about someone you were supposed to marry? Would you have turned them in to save yourself? Or would you have helped them escape, knowing it could destroy your life? It's easy to say we'd do the right thing when we're not the ones facing the consequences. It's harder when the dogs are baying and the torches are coming closer and everything you've ever known is on the line. Margaret made her choice. Gabriel made his. And both of them lived with regret and loss, and the knowledge that they'd done something that mattered, even if the world never knew. Their story was buried for decades, almost lost to history entirely. But now you know it. And maybe that's what Margaret would have wanted. Not fame or recognition, but for people to remember that courage doesn't always look like battles and grand gestures. Sometimes it looks like a young woman on a horse, riding through the darkness to save someone she barely knows. Sometimes it looks like choosing the harder path because it's the right one. And sometimes it looks like living your whole life with a secret that could have destroyed you, but didn't, because you knew who you were and what you stood for. Let me know in the comments what you think about this story. How do you think you would have reacted if you were Margaret? Could you have kept that secret for your entire life? And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things, make sure you subscribe, because history is full of forgotten heroes, and they deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching.